When the plane's brakes failed at 100 miles per hour, everyone thought they were about to die. The pilots had no solution. Passengers were screaming. But one college student carrying textbooks knew something nobody else did. She made one move that saved 179 lives. This is that incredible true story. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The autumn sun hung low over Chicago O'Hare International Airport as passengers shuffled through the crowded terminal, dragging wheeled luggage and clutching boarding passes for the afternoon flight to Los Angeles. Among the throng of travelers moving toward Gate B-17 was Maya Chen, an 18-year-old college student who looked every bit the part of a typical undergraduate making her way through another semester of university life. She wore faded jeans, worn sneakers, and a navy blue hoodie with her school's logo barely visible beneath the straps of an overstuffed backpack. Her second bag, a canvas tote, bulged with textbooks, notebooks, and a laptop that had seen better days. To anyone watching, she was just another college kid heading home for Thanksgiving break, probably studying something ordinary like business or communications, focused on papers and exams rather than anything remotely connected to the complex machinery of aviation. As Maya waited in the boarding line, a friendly flight attendant named Jennifer scanned her ticket and smiled warmly. "Heading home for the holidays?" she asked, making the kind of small talk that filled the gaps between destinations. Maya nodded, returning the smile. "Yeah, going to see my family in California," she replied softly. Jennifer glanced at the heavy backpack and chuckled. "Looks like you're bringing half the library with you. What are you studying?" Maya hesitated for just a moment before answering, "Engineering." The flight attendant's eyes lit up with polite interest, though it was clear she assumed it was something general, maybe civil or electrical, certainly nothing that would matter 30,000 feet in the air. "That's wonderful, honey. Good luck with your studies," Jennifer said before waving her through. Maya made her way down the jet bridge and into the Boeing 737, finding her seat in row 23, a middle seat squeezed between a businessman typing furiously on his laptop and an elderly woman already settling in with a crossword puzzle. She wedged her backpack under the seat in front of her and pulled out one of her textbooks, a thick volume titled Advanced Aircraft Systems and Emergency Procedures. The businessman glanced over briefly, saw the complex diagrams on the pages, and quickly looked away, probably assuming it was just another dense college textbook that all students had to suffer through. The elderly woman smiled at her kindly and asked, "First time flying alone, dear?" Maya shook her head. "No, ma'am, I fly pretty often actually." The woman patted her hand. "Well, you're braver than I was at your age. What are you studying in school?" Maya closed her book slightly, the title now hidden. "Aerospace Engineering with a focus on aircraft braking systems and emergency flight mechanics." The woman's face showed polite confusion, clearly not understanding what any of that meant. "Oh, that sounds very complicated. I'm sure you'll do wonderful things, dear." The cabin filled quickly as more passengers boarded, stuffing bags into overhead compartments and settling into their seats with the practiced efficiency of frequent flyers. A young mother with two small children took seats across the aisle from Maya, struggling to keep the kids entertained with coloring books and snacks. Behind her, a group of college students laughed loudly, clearly heading back to California for break, talking about parties and beach plans. Maya felt a pang of recognition, knowing that to everyone around her, she looked just like those carefree students, someone whose biggest worry was probably an upcoming exam or a term paper deadline. Nobody could have guessed that her backpack contained research papers on hydraulic system failures that she had written for a graduate-level seminar, or that she spent her weekends in aviation maintenance hangars studying brake assemblies with retired aircraft mechanics who treated her like a curious kid rather than a serious researcher. A flight attendant named Marcus walked down the aisle checking seatbelts, pausing at Maya's row. He noticed her textbook and smiled. "That looks intense. Engineering student?" Maya nodded, closing the book slightly. "Yeah, aerospace engineering." Marcus chuckled warmly. "My daughter just started college too. Business major." Says she wants to work in marketing or something creative. I keep telling her to study something practical like you're doing, but you know how kids are. He shook his head with paternal affection. At least she's not studying philosophy, right? Maya smiled politely, not mentioning that her practical studies included classified research on catastrophic aircraft failures that most aviation professionals would never encounter in their careers. Marcus moved on, completely unaware that this polite young student understood more about the aircraft he was working on than most of the pilots who flew it. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard Flight 2847 to Los Angeles, announcing an on-time departure and smooth weather ahead. Maya barely listened, her attention absorbed by the technical diagrams in her textbook showing hydraulic brake system schematics, anti-skid mechanisms, and emergency stopping procedures that most pilots never had to use in their entire careers. She was in her second year at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, studying aerospace engineering under one of the world's leading experts in aircraft systems design. Her focus wasn't on building planes but on understanding every mechanical detail of how they worked, especially the systems that kept passengers safe during the most dangerous phases of flight, takeoff and landing. What nobody on the plane knew, what even her professors rarely discussed outside classified research settings, was that Maya had spent the previous summer interning at a major aircraft manufacturer's testing facility where she had worked directly with engineers developing next-generation braking systems. She had witnessed brake failures in controlled test environments, studied the catastrophic results of hydraulic system malfunctions, and learned unconventional emergency procedures that existed in engineering manuals but never made it into standard pilot training curricula. Her senior mentor had told her something she never forgot: the difference between a safe landing and a disaster sometimes comes down to knowing one thing that nobody else in that cockpit knows. Maya had treated those words like a sacred warning, studying every edge case, every backup system, every theoretical solution to problems that should never happen but sometimes did. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway, and lifted smoothly into the late afternoon sky. The flight was unremarkable for the first 3 hours, the kind of routine journey that millions of people experienced every day without giving it a second thought. Flight attendants served drinks and snacks, passengers dozed or watched movies on their phones, and the businessman beside Maya continued working on what appeared to be an endless stream of spreadsheets. Maya read her textbook for a while before switching to a laptop to review notes from her recent project on hydraulic system redundancy failures. About an hour into the flight, the businessman beside her glanced over at her laptop screen, seeing complex engineering diagrams and technical formulas. He seemed curious enough to strike up conversation. "That looks pretty complicated," he said, gesturing toward her screen. "What exactly are you working on?" Maya minimized the window slightly, always cautious about discussing her research in public. "Just a project for my engineering class. Studying how aircraft systems handle failures." The man nodded, impressed but not particularly interested in the details. "Good for you. My company manufactures automotive parts, so I understand manufacturing quality control, but aircraft stuff is way over my head. You must be pretty smart to understand all that." He said it kindly, but with the subtle condescension that adults often used with college students, as if her studies were impressive for someone her age but not truly significant in the real world. "How old are you anyway? You look like you just graduated high school." Maya smiled patiently. "I'm 18. Second year at MIT." The man whistled appreciatively. "MIT? That's serious. My nephew wants to go there. What do you want to do after graduation? Work for NASA or something?" Maya considered her answer carefully. "I want to work in aviation safety. Making sure systems don't fail, and when they do, making sure there are solutions." The businessman nodded absently, already losing interest, turning back to his spreadsheets. To him, she was just another ambitious kid with dreams that sounded impressive but probably wouldn't amount to much. He had no way of knowing that within 2 hours, this ambitious kid would be the only person on the aircraft with the knowledge to save his life. She was so absorbed in her work that she barely noticed when the captain announced their initial descent into Los Angeles. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and passengers began the familiar ritual of putting away electronics, returning seats to their upright positions, and preparing for landing. Maya glanced out the window, seeing the sprawling lights of Los Angeles spreading out below them like a glittering carpet. The descent was smooth, the aircraft making its approach to LAX with the kind of precision that came from thousands of successful landings. The runway lights appeared in the distance, growing larger as the plane dropped altitude. Maya felt the familiar sensation of the landing gear extending, heard the mechanical thump as the wheels locked into position. Everything seemed perfectly normal, just another routine landing at one of the world's busiest airports. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold, and the main landing gear touched down with a gentle bump. This was the moment when passengers typically relaxed, knowing they were safely on the ground, already thinking about baggage claim and ground transportation. But within seconds of touchdown, Maya felt something wrong. The aircraft wasn't slowing down the way it should. Instead of the familiar deceleration that pushed passengers forward against their seatbelts, the plane seemed to be maintaining its speed, rolling down the runway faster than normal. She heard the engines roar louder as the pilots deployed thrust reversers, but still the aircraft wasn't slowing adequately. Something was terribly wrong. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Harrison and First Officer Lisa Martinez were experiencing every pilot's nightmare. The moment they attempted to apply the brakes after touchdown, nothing happened. The brake pedals felt dead beneath their feet, offering no resistance, no response. Captain Harrison immediately tried the emergency backup system, but the pedals remained lifeless. "No brakes, no brakes," he shouted to his first officer. Lisa Martinez's hands flew across the control panel, attempting to activate the alternate brake system, the emergency hydraulic backup, anything that might give them stopping power. Nothing worked. The entire brake system had failed completely, both primary and backup circuits, a catastrophic malfunction that should have been impossible with modern aircraft redundancy systems. LAX Tower, Flight 2847, we have complete brake failure, I repeat, complete brake failure. Captain Harrison's voice crackled over the radio with barely controlled panic. The aircraft was rolling down the runway at over 100 miles per hour with no way to stop. They had already deployed maximum thrust reversers, which were helping but nowhere near enough. The spoilers were fully extended, creating aerodynamic drag, but the aircraft was still moving too fast. The runway was only 10,000 feet long, and they had already used more than half of it. Captain Harrison could see the end of the runway approaching terrifyingly fast, and beyond it, the airport perimeter fence, a highway, and buildings that would tear the aircraft apart if they couldn't stop. In the cabin, passengers began to realize something was horribly wrong. The aircraft should have been taxiing slowly by now, but instead they were still moving at high speed, the vibration of the tires on the runway growing more violent. People started looking around nervously, sensing the wrongness even before the announcement came. A teenage boy a few rows ahead pulled out his phone, trying to capture video, his hands shaking. An older man gripped his wife's hand tightly, both of them silent with fear. The college students who had been laughing earlier were now deathly quiet, their faces pale. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but urgent, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a brake malfunction. Brace for emergency stop. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin." The word sent a wave of terror through the passengers. People grabbed their armrests, some started crying, others began praying. The young mother across the aisle pulled her children close, tears streaming down her face. One child asked innocently, "Mommy, why are we going so fast?" and the mother couldn't answer, just held them tighter. The businessman beside Maya stopped typing and gripped his laptop like it might somehow protect him, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by raw fear. The elderly woman clutched Maya's hand tightly, her face pale with fear. "We're going to die, aren't we?" she whispered. A man several rows back started shouting for someone to do something, his panic infectious. Flight attendants in their jump seats were crying, knowing exactly how bad the situation was, trained to stay calm but unable to hide their terror. Maya's mind snapped into sharp focus, years of training and study suddenly crystallizing into clarity. She knew exactly what was happening. Complete hydraulic brake failure on both primary and alternate systems meant the pilots were relying solely on aerodynamic braking thrust reversers and spoilers which were never designed to stop an aircraft by themselves from landing speed. She knew the runway length at LAX, knew the aircraft's approximate landing weight, and could calculate in her head that they had maybe 30 seconds before the aircraft ran out of runway and crashed. The pilots were doing everything in their standard training, but standard training didn't cover this specific scenario because it was considered so unlikely that most pilots never learned the unconventional solution. But Maya knew the solution. During her internship, she had studied a classified emergency procedure that existed in engineering documentation but had never been added to pilot training manuals because it was considered too dangerous and too complex for real-world application. The procedure involved manually overriding the engine control system to deploy asymmetric thrust reverse beyond normal limits while simultaneously using differential spoiler deployment to create intentional aerodynamic instability that would dramatically increase drag. It was a theoretical procedure that had only been tested in computer simulations, never in actual flight, because the risk of losing control was enormous. But she also knew that without this procedure, they had zero chance of stopping before the end of the runway. Maya's hands trembled as she unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the protests from the passengers around her. "What are you doing?" the businessman shouted at her, his voice cracking with fear. "Sit down. You'll get yourself killed." The elderly woman grabbed at her sleeve, trying to pull her back. "Please dear, don't leave me." Maya gently squeezed her hand. "Trust me," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I know what to do." She pushed her way into the aisle, stumbling as the aircraft bounced violently over the runway surface. Other passengers stared at her like she had lost her mind, this teenage girl running toward the cockpit during an emergency. One man tried to grab her arm. "Are you crazy? Sit down." Maya wrenched free, her mind singularly focused on reaching the pilots before it was too late. Flight attendants were already in their jump seats, strapped in for emergency landing protocol, their eyes wide with terror. Marcus, the attendant who had complimented her studies earlier, shouted at her over the roar of the engines. "Get back to your seat. Now." But something in Maya's expression, the fierce determination mixed with knowledge rather than panic, made him hesitate. She wasn't running in fear, she was running with purpose. Maya reached the cockpit door and pounded on it desperately, her fists hammering against the reinforced barrier. "Let me in. I can help. I'm an aerospace engineering student. I know how to stop the plane." Her voice was raw, desperate, competing with the screaming engines and the terrified cries of passengers behind her. Inside the cockpit, Captain Harrison and First Officer Martinez heard the pounding but ignored it, focused entirely on their instruments and the rapidly approaching end of the runway. They had maybe 15 seconds left before they would run out of pavement. The tower was screaming instructions over the radio, emergency vehicles were racing toward the runway, but none of it mattered because they were going to crash. Lisa Martinez looked at her captain with desperation in her eyes. "We're not going to make it," she said quietly. Captain Harrison's jaw clenched. "Deploy emergency foam, full spoilers, max reverse thrust. It's all we've got." Maya pounded on the door again, harder this time, shouting at the top of her lungs. "Asymmetric thrust reverse. Override the engine limiters. Deploy differential spoilers. It's the only way." Her voice carried through the thin cockpit door, and something in her tone, the technical precision of her words, made Captain Harrison hesitate. He had never heard those terms used together in that sequence. It wasn't standard procedure, wasn't in any manual he had studied in 30 years of flying. But they were out of options and out of time. He reached over and unlocked the cockpit door. Maya burst into the cockpit, her young face flushed with adrenaline and terror but her eyes sharp with certainty. Captain Harrison stared at this teenage girl in a college hoodie who had just invaded his cockpit during an emergency. "Who the hell are you, he demanded. Maya spoke rapidly, her words tumbling out in a rush. I'm Maya Chen, aerospace engineering student at MIT. I interned at Boeing's testing facility. I studied brake failure scenarios. I know an emergency procedure that can stop us, but we have maybe 10 seconds to do it. Captain Harrison looked at First Officer Martinez, who looked back at him with an expression that said they were dead anyway. What did they have to lose? Talk fast, Captain Harrison said, his hands still gripping the controls uselessly. Maya leaned between the two pilots, pointing at the engine thrust controls. You need to manually override the thrust reverse limiters on engine 1 only, push it beyond the normal safety threshold to create asymmetric reverse thrust. At the same time, deploy spoilers 3 and 5 on the right wing to maximum extension while keeping spoilers 2 and 4 on the left wing at minimum. The asymmetric thrust will try to yaw the aircraft left, but the differential spoiler deployment will create opposing aerodynamic force while dramatically increasing total drag. The aircraft will want to spin out, but if you counter with right rudder and maintain centerline with nose wheel steering, the combined drag forces will stop us. Captain Harrison stared at her like she had just spoken in an alien language. Everything she described violated every principle of safe aircraft operation. Creating intentional asymmetry during landing was exactly what pilots were trained never to do because it could cause the aircraft to spin out of control, flip over, or tear itself apart. But as he looked at the runway end approaching with horrifying speed, he realized this college kid was offering them the only option that wasn't certain death. If I do this wrong, we'll cartwheel down the runway, he said. Maya met his eyes steadily. If you don't do it at all, we hit the perimeter fence at 80 miles per hour. I've studied the engineering. The aircraft structure can handle the stress if you balance the forces correctly. Trust the math. Trust the physics. There was no more time for debate. The end of the runway was 5 seconds away. Captain Harrison made a decision that would either save everyone aboard or kill them all. Lisa, override engine 1 thrust reverse limiter, full emergency authority. First Officer Martinez's hands flew across the control panel, fingers dancing over switches that she had never touched in actual flight, only in simulator emergencies. She found the manual override, disabled the safety limiter, and pushed the thrust lever for engine 1 far beyond its normal range. The left engine screamed with protest, reverse thrust increasing to dangerous levels that sent violent vibrations through the airframe. The aircraft immediately began yawing hard to the left as the asymmetric thrust tried to spin them off the runway. Captain Harrison stomped on the right rudder pedal while simultaneously deploying the differential spoilers exactly as Maya had described. Spoilers 3 and 5 on the right wing shot up to maximum extension while spoilers 2 and 4 on the left wing barely extended at all, creating a bizarre, unbalanced aerodynamic configuration that no aircraft was ever meant to fly in. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The aircraft shuddered violently as conflicting forces tore at its structure, but the massive increase in drag began slowing them down at a rate that seemed impossible. Maya gripped the back of the captain's seat, her knuckles white, watching the instruments and feeling the aircraft's response. More right rudder, counter the yaw, keep the nose straight, she shouted over the roar of the straining engines. Captain Harrison was fighting the controls with every ounce of strength, the aircraft bucking and shaking like a wild animal trying to throw him off. The tires were screaming on the runway, creating plumes of smoke, heated beyond their design limits by the friction. Warning alarms blared throughout the cockpit, red lights flashing across every panel, the aircraft's computer system screaming that they were about to tear the plane apart. But it was working. The airspeed indicator was dropping rapidly, faster than should have been possible with aerodynamic braking alone. 90 miles per hour. 80 miles per hour. 70. The end of the runway was right in front of them, the perimeter fence clearly visible, emergency vehicles racing alongside them, fire crews preparing for the worst. 60 miles per hour. 50. The aircraft was still shaking violently, the asymmetric forces threatening to rip it apart, but Captain Harrison held the controls steady, trusting this teenage engineering student's calculations with the lives of everyone aboard. 40 miles per hour. 30. 20. The aircraft was still moving when the nose wheel crossed over the runway end line, but the speed was low enough now that Captain Harrison could use the nose wheel steering to guide them off onto the grass overrun area. The moment the wheels hit the soft ground, the remaining speed bled off rapidly, the grass and soft earth providing the final resistance they needed. The aircraft rolled to a complete stop barely 50 feet beyond the end of the runway, tilted slightly to one side but intact, engines still running, everyone aboard still alive. For a long moment, nobody in the cockpit moved. Captain Harrison's hands were still gripping the controls, his entire body shaking with adrenaline. First Officer Martinez was breathing hard, staring at the instrument panel like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Maya slowly released her death grip on the seat back, her legs suddenly weak beneath her. The radio crackled to life with urgent calls from the tower, emergency vehicles surrounding the aircraft, but inside the cockpit there was only stunned silence. Captain Harrison finally turned to look at Maya, this 18-year-old college student in a hoodie who had just saved the lives of 173 passengers and 6 crew members with knowledge that shouldn't have existed outside classified engineering documents. "How did you know that would work?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Maya took a shaky breath before answering. "Last summer I worked at Boeing's testing facility in Seattle. We were developing next-generation brake systems and studying failure scenarios. One of the senior engineers showed me simulations of total hydraulic brake failure, the kind of catastrophic malfunction that's supposed to be impossible. He showed me this procedure, said it was theoretical, never tested in real aircraft because it was too dangerous. But the math worked in simulations. The asymmetric thrust creates rotational deceleration while the differential spoiler deployment increases drag without allowing the yaw to become uncontrollable. It's not in any pilot training manual because aviation authorities consider it too risky, but the engineering is sound." First Officer Martinez laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "Too risky? We just did something that could have torn the wings off and you're saying it was too risky to teach pilots?" Maya managed a weak smile. "The official position is that brake failures this complete don't happen, so the procedure isn't necessary. But my mentor said that sometimes the difference between theory and reality is measured in lives saved." Captain Harrison unbuckled his harness and stood up, his legs unsteady. He pulled Maya into a tight hug, and she felt him trembling. "You just saved everyone on this aircraft," he said quietly. "I've been flying for 30 years and I've never heard of that procedure. If you hadn't been on this plane, we'd all be dead right now." The cabin door burst open as flight attendants rushed into the cockpit, tears streaming down their faces, asking if everyone was okay. Behind them, passengers were beginning to realize they had stopped, they were safe, they had survived something that should have killed them all. Emergency evacuation slides deployed, and the crew began the rapid evacuation process, getting passengers off the aircraft as quickly as possible in case there was fire risk or structural damage. Maya tried to slip back into the cabin, wanting to avoid attention, but Captain Harrison kept a firm hand on her shoulder. "You're not going anywhere until you talk to investigators. What you just did needs to be documented and studied. This procedure needs to become standard training." As passengers evacuated down the emergency slides, many of them had no idea what had actually happened, only that they had experienced a rough landing and were being evacuated as a precaution. But the crew knew. The pilots knew. And as Maya finally descended the slide and stood on the grass beside the crippled aircraft, surrounded by emergency vehicles and investigators already swarming the scene, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. She had used knowledge that most people her age didn't possess, applied engineering theory in a real-world crisis, and made one critical decision that had saved 179 lives. Federal Aviation Administration investigators arrived within minutes, along with representatives from the National Transportation Safety Board, the airline's safety officers, and Boeing engineering teams. Maya found herself sitting in a mobile command center, still wearing her college hoodie, being questioned by people with decades of experience in aviation safety. She explained the procedure step by step, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard, walking them through the engineering principles that made asymmetric thrust reverse combined with differential spoiler deployment an effective emergency stopping technique despite violating conventional wisdom about symmetric aircraft operation. The lead FAA investigator, a gray-haired man named Thomas Brennan who had investigated hundreds of aviation incidents, listened intently to Maya's explanation before asking the question. That was on everyone's mind. How does an 18-year-old college student know about an emergency procedure that qualified pilots with thousands of flight hours have never heard of? Maya explained her internship, her coursework at MIT, her specific focus on aircraft braking systems and emergency mechanics. She explained that her mentor at Boeing, a legendary engineer named Dr. Richard Kovalenko, had shown her classified research into catastrophic brake failure scenarios because he believed young engineers needed to understand that theoretical knowledge could someday save lives. Dr. Kovalenko himself arrived at LAX 6 hours later, having taken the first flight from Seattle when he heard about the incident. When investigators told him that his former intern had used the procedure he had shown her to save a commercial aircraft, he wept openly. I showed her that simulation because I wanted her to understand that engineering isn't just about building things, it's about solving problems that shouldn't exist but sometimes do, he told investigators. I never imagined she would actually use it. I never imagined the scenario would actually happen. But she remembered. She understood the principles well enough to apply them under pressure. That's not just knowledge, that's exceptional engineering intuition. The story of Flight 2847 spread rapidly through aviation circles and then broke into mainstream news. An 18-year-old college student saves plane with one move became the headline that captured the world's attention. News crews descended on LAX, wanting to interview the young hero who had prevented disaster. Maya's phone exploded with messages from classmates, professors, family members who had seen the news. Her parents, watching from California, couldn't believe their daughter had been on the aircraft, let alone in the cockpit, let alone responsible for saving everyone aboard. Her mother called her crying, unable to speak for several minutes, just repeating, thank God, over and over. Her father, typically stoic and reserved, broke down when he finally heard her voice, realizing how close he had come to losing his daughter. But Maya deflected the hero narrative whenever reporters asked. I just applied what I learned, she said repeatedly. The real heroes are my professors who taught me to think about edge cases and failure scenarios. The real hero is Dr. Kovalenko who showed me that procedure and trusted me to understand it. The real heroes are Captain Harrison and First Officer Martinez who trusted a college kid and had the skill to execute an incredibly difficult maneuver under extreme pressure. I just connected knowledge to crisis. That's what engineering is supposed to do. The investigation into the brake failure itself revealed a sobering truth. A microscopic manufacturing defect in a hydraulic valve component had created a cascading failure that defeated both primary and backup brake systems simultaneously, exactly the kind of one-in-a-million malfunction that safety engineers designed redundant systems to prevent. The defect had existed since the aircraft was manufactured 3 years earlier, undetectable through standard inspection procedures, waiting for the precise combination of temperature, pressure, and stress that finally triggered total system failure. The aircraft had made thousands of successful landings before that one critical failure on approach to LAX. Engineers examining the failed components were shocked by how such a tiny defect, invisible to the naked eye and undetectable by normal testing, had caused such catastrophic consequences. Boeing and the FAA immediately issued emergency directives to inspect every aircraft using similar hydraulic valve components, grounding hundreds of planes worldwide until inspections could be completed. The investigation concluded that without Maya's intervention, Flight 2847 would have overrun the runway at approximately 75 miles per hour, collided with the perimeter fence and ground equipment, and likely resulted in catastrophic loss of life for most if not all passengers and crew. Her quick thinking and specialized knowledge had prevented what would have been one of the worst aviation disasters in recent history. The broader aviation community began seriously discussing whether the emergency procedure Maya had used should be incorporated into pilot training. The procedure was controversial because it violated so many principles of safe aircraft operation, but the undeniable fact was that it had worked exactly as engineering theory predicted. Flight simulator tests conducted in the weeks following the incident confirmed that trained pilots could execute the procedure successfully, though it required considerable skill and nerve to manage the asymmetric forces without losing control. Within 6 months, the FAA added a modified version of the procedure to emergency training curricula for commercial pilots, with specific instructions on when and how it could be safely attempted. Maya returned to MIT as a minor celebrity on campus, though she tried to maintain her normal student life. Her professors treated her with new respect, not because she had been on television but because she had demonstrated the real-world value of theoretical knowledge. Other students looked at her differently now, with a mixture of awe and curiosity, wondering what it felt like to save nearly 200 lives before turning 19. Some asked her endless questions about the experience, wanting every detail. Others treated her with awkward reverence, as if she had become something more than human. Maya found the attention overwhelming and often ate lunch alone in the engineering library, hiding among the stacks of technical journals where nobody bothered her. Dr. Kovalenko arranged for her to present a paper on the incident at an aerospace engineering conference, where she discussed the importance of teaching unconventional solutions alongside standard procedures. Her presentation was attended by industry leaders, military engineers, and safety investigators who wanted to understand how an undergraduate student had known something that experienced pilots didn't. She stood at the podium in a conference hall filled with people who had decades more experience than her, and she explained with quiet confidence why theoretical knowledge mattered, why studying edge cases was essential, and why young engineers should never be dismissed simply because of their age. Captain Robert Harrison and First Officer Lisa Martinez both visited Maya at MIT several months later, wanting to thank her personally in a setting away from media attention and official investigations. They brought her a gift, a piece of metal from the aircraft, carefully removed during the investigation, mounted on a plaque with an inscription that read, "To Maya Chen, who taught us that the best solutions sometimes come from the youngest voices." With gratitude from the crew and passengers of Flight 2847. Maya hung it in her dorm room, a reminder that all the late nights studying dense textbooks and complex engineering principles had mattered in the most concrete way possible. She would sometimes touch the piece of metal before exams or when doubting herself, remembering that knowledge wasn't abstract but powerful and real. The incident changed Maya's trajectory. She switched her focus from general aerospace engineering to specializing in aircraft safety systems and emergency procedures, determined to help prevent future catastrophic failures. She worked with Boeing engineers to improve brake system redundancy designs, consulted with training organizations on developing better emergency curricula, and eventually co-authored a paper with Dr. Kovalenko on unconventional emergency procedures that became required reading in aerospace engineering programs worldwide. Her experience on Flight 2847 had shown her that engineering knowledge wasn't abstract theory but practical power that could mean the difference between disaster and survival. The elderly woman who had sat beside her on the flight, whose name was Margaret Henderson, tracked Maya down through the airline and sent her a handwritten letter. "You held my hand during the scariest moment of my life," Margaret wrote. "I thought we were going to die together. But you didn't freeze, you didn't panic, you ran toward the danger instead of away from it. I want you to know that because of you, I got to see my grandchildren again, I got to celebrate another Christmas, I got to live. Thank you for being brave when the rest of us were too scared to move. You reminded me that heroes come in all ages and that sometimes the person who saves you is the one you least expect." Years later, after graduating summa cum laude from MIT and beginning her career as a safety engineer at the National Transportation Safety Board, Maya would sometimes think back to that terrifying moment in the cockpit when Captain Harrison had to decide whether to trust a teenage college student's knowledge over his decades of experience and training. She thought about how close they had come to disaster, how many small factors had to align perfectly for her to be on that specific flight, to have the specific knowledge needed, to have the courage to act when every instinct told passengers to stay seated and trust the professionals. She thought about the elderly woman who had held her hand during the emergency, the businessman who had yelled at her to sit down, the young mother with 2 children who had been crying across the aisle, the flight attendants who had watched in disbelief as she ran to the cockpit, and the 173 passengers who went home to their families that night because engineering knowledge met aviation crisis at exactly the right moment. The story of Flight 2847 became a case study taught in aviation schools and engineering programs, an example of how specialized knowledge could come from unexpected sources and how the combination of theoretical understanding and practical courage could solve problems that seemed unsolvable. Maya Chen, the 18-year-old college student in a hoodie who had saved everyone aboard with one move, became a symbol of why diverse voices and unconventional thinking belonged in every field, why young people's knowledge should be respected alongside experience, and why the answer to impossible problems sometimes came from someone who had studied the textbooks everyone else had forgotten existed. As she stood on the runway that evening, watching investigators examine the crippled aircraft, Maya had thought about her engineering professors who had pushed her to understand not just how systems worked but how they could fail. She thought about Dr. Kovalenko who had trusted her with knowledge that was supposed to remain theoretical. And she thought about all the students like her, carrying backpacks full of textbooks, dismissed as typical teenagers focused on grades and social lives, never suspected of possessing extraordinary knowledge that might someday save lives. The world saw college students as young people still learning, still becoming, not yet ready to contribute meaningfully to solving real problems. But Maya knew differently now. She knew that sometimes the person who could save everyone was the one nobody expected, the one carrying engineering textbooks in a worn backpack, the one who looked too young to know anything important but who had studied hard enough to know the one thing that mattered when everything else failed. The brake failure on Flight 2847 had been catastrophic, impossible, the kind of emergency that pilots pray never happens because conventional procedures offered no solution. But Maya Chen had made one move, applied one procedure, connected one piece of theoretical knowledge to one moment of crisis, and turned certain disaster into survival. She had shown that the difference between tragedy and triumph could be measured in knowledge, courage, and the willingness to trust that sometimes the youngest voice in the room knew exactly what needed to be done. And as emergency crews worked through the night to secure the aircraft and investigators began the painstaking process of understanding exactly what had failed and how it had been fixed, Maya finally called her parents to tell them she was safe and to explain why she was going to be a little late getting home for Thanksgiving break. She had a story to tell them, about textbooks and engineering in one critical moment when everything she had studied suddenly mattered more than anyone could have imagined. It was a story about how knowledge saves lives, how courage comes in unexpected packages, and how sometimes the hero nobody expects is the 18-year-old student sitting in seat 23 with a backpack full of textbooks and the determination to use them when it counts. Her father listened in silence, then said something she would never forget: "We raised you to be smart, but you chose to be brave. That's the difference that saved all those people." Maya realized he was right. Knowledge had given her the solution, but courage had given her the will to act on it, to run toward danger when everyone else was frozen in fear, to trust herself when doubt would have been easier. And in that combination of knowledge and courage, 179 lives had been saved by one move from one young woman who refused to be dismissed simply because of her age.